when heaven interrupts the noise of the world, not with comfort, but with urgency. You did not arrive at this message by accident, because God does not waste divine timing on empty coincidences. Something in your spirit has been restless, a quiet alarm sounding beneath your daily routine, and now the truth is pressing against your soul like thunder before the storm. The distractions around you have multiplied because the enemy fears what will happen when you finally listen to the voice of God without hesitation. This is not merely motivation, this is a spiritual emergency calling the chosen to awaken before the door closes. There are seasons in life when God whispers gently, and there are seasons when He speaks through disruption. The chosen often mistake divine warnings for ordinary inconvenience because the human heart naturally clings to comfort. Yet long before every great collapse, heaven sends signals. Noah heard the warning before the rain. Joseph received dreams before the famine. Daniel understood the danger before kingdoms trembled. God has always revealed what was coming before the earth could see it with natural eyes. That is why the spirit within you has felt unsettled lately. The pressure, the sleepless thoughts, the strange sense that something is shifting around your life are not random emotions. They are signs that heaven is trying to prepare you before the shaking begins. Most people wait until the storm arrives before they seek God with seriousness. They pray after the damage, cry after the betrayal, and search for truth only after darkness has already entered the room. But the chosen are called to hear the alarm before the collapse. That is what separates spiritual vision from ordinary living. The world mocks warnings because it worships what is visible. But faith has always required the courage to move before evidence appears. C.S. Lewis once understood that the greatest danger to the soul is not sudden destruction but slow distraction. The enemy rarely destroys a man all at once. He numbs him gradually. He fills the days with noise, endless scrolling, shallow conversations, and temporary pleasures until the soul can no longer recognize the voice of eternity. You have felt this battle in your own life. There have been moments when you sensed God calling you higher, but something always tried to pull your attention away at the exact moment. Revelation began to arrive. That is not coincidence. Darkness fears awareness because once a chosen person fully awakens, chains begin to break. The enemy cannot easily control a soul that recognizes the season it is standing in. This is why confusion has increased around you. This is why some relationships suddenly feel heavy. This is why old habits no longer satisfy your spirit the way they once did. God is allowing discomfort to expose what can no longer follow you into your next assignment. The warning always comes before the collapse because mercy moves ahead of judgment. Even now, God is not trying to destroy you, He is trying to rescue you from what would destroy you later. Some people interpret divine interruption as punishment when it is actually protection. The closed door, the delayed plan, the sudden separation. The restless nights, these may be the very things keeping your soul from a greater disaster that you cannot yet see. Human beings often pray for comfort while God is trying to build character. They ask for peace while refusing the transformation required to receive it. There is also a deeper reason why warnings are ignored. Pride convinces people they stay. I'll have time. The heart whispers, tomorrow I will change. Tomorrow I will pray. Tomorrow I will obey. Yet history is filled with people who believed they had another tomorrow until the moment suddenly vanished. The chosen cannot afford spiritual delay because destiny moves on divine timing, not human convenience. When God sends a warning, it is not merely information, it is an invitation to escape what is coming upon the careless and the sleeping. Right now, many are living as though eternity is distant, while their souls quietly starve beneath the surface. They decorate the outside of their lives while neglecting the eternal condition of their hearts. But eventually every false foundation collapses. Wealth cannot stop it. Status cannot silence it. Intelligence cannot escape it. Only truth remains standing when the shaking begins. And perhaps this is why your spirit has become increasingly uncomfortable with superficial living. Because God is teaching you to recognize the difference between what merely entertains the flesh and what actually feeds the soul. The tragedy is that many people resist the very interruption that was sent to save them. They become angry when God dismantles. Routines remove certain people or allows discomfort to invade their carefully constructed plans. Yet heaven does not interrupt without purpose. God sees what human eyes cannot see. He understands where a path will end long before your feet arrive there. What feels like inconvenience today may actually be mercy standing between you and destruction tomorrow. The chosen one must eventually learn that divine love is not always gentle in appearance. Sometimes it arrives like a storm tearing apart the false security you depended upon. Comfort can become one of the greatest enemies of calling because it persuades a soul to settle in places where growth has already ended. A man can remain spiritually asleep for years simply because his life feels manageable. He mistakes survival for purpose and routine for destiny. But when God has marked someone for a greater assignment, he refuses to let them remain comfortable forever. There comes a moment when heaven begins shaking the walls around the chosen, not to ruin them, but to awaken them. The very peace you once depended upon begins disappearing because your spirit was never created to live imprisoned inside temporary things. This is why some seasons feel so confusing. You pray for clarity, yet everything becomes uncertain. You ask God for direction, yet doors suddenly close. You try to hold together what used to work, but the grace that once covered those situations begins to lift. It feels painful because human nature clings tightly to familiarity, even when familiarity is slowly killing the soul. God interrupts comfort because he loves destiny more than temporary ease. He understands that if he leaves the chosen untouched by discomfort, they may never rise into the fullness of what they were created to become. C.S. Lewis understood that pain often acts as God's megaphone to a deaf world. When comfort controls a person, they rarely seek deeper truth. They become satisfied with surface living. But suffering has a way of exposing illusions. It strips away the masks people hide behind. It reveals where faith is genuine and where it was merely performance. This is why some of the greatest transformations in history were born in seasons of breaking rather than seasons of abundance. Moses encountered the burning bush in exile. David was shaped in wilderness caves before he ever touched a throne. Even Christ himself as led into the wilderness before stepping fully into public purpose. You may have wondered why certain things no longer satisfy you the way they once did. Conversations feel empty. Entertainment feels hollow. Places that once brought excitement now leave a strange heaviness in your spirit. This is not accidental. God is disturbing your comfort because your soul has outgrown the environment around it. The chosen often feel isolated during these moments because few people understand the burden of spiritual awakening. Others may tell you to relax, to stop overthinking, to return to the old version of yourself. But deep inside, you already know you cannot go back to sleep after heaven has touched your spirit. There are also relationships God interrupts for a reason. Some people were only assigned to a chapter of your life, not the entire journey. Yet many chosen ones delay their destiny because they keep trying to preserve connections God is already removing. Not everyone can follow you into the next season because not everyone is willing to grow where God is taking you. This separation feels cruel at first, but divine pruning always precedes greater fruit. God removes what continua. Lily drains your spirit so your calling can breathe again. The frightening thing about comfort is that it can disguise spiritual decay. A person may appear successful outwardly while their soul quietly weakens inwardly. They continue smiling, posting, laughing, and functioning while slowly drifting away from the voice of God. But heaven loves the chosen too much to allow endless drifting. So eventually the interruption comes. Plans fail, illusions break, silence grows louder than distraction. And suddenly the person realizes that God was never trying to destroy their life. He was tearing down the prison they mistook for peace. Many people ask God to reveal their purpose, but few are willing to survive the process required to uncover it. Calling demands transformation. Transformation demands surrender. And surrender almost always begins with discomfort. God interrupts your comfort because he sees the version of you that still remains buried beneath fear, distraction, pride, and compromise. He is calling that hidden person forward, even if the process feels painful beyond understanding, and this is where the battle becomes even more intense. Because the moment a chosen person begins, awakening to purpose, resistance suddenly increases from every direction. The enemy is rarely threatened by someone who is asleep. Darkness does not waste energy attacking people who are already distracted, numb, and spiritually passive. But when heaven begins calling a soul into destiny, opposition rises almost immediately. Many chosen ones become frightened during this stage because they mistake resistance as proof they are failing, when in reality, It is often evidence that they are moving closer to something eternal. The enemy attacks most when destiny is near because breakthrough always threatens the kingdom of darkness. Before every great elevation in Scripture, there was warfare. Before Joseph reached the palace, betrayal surrounded him. Before David touched the crown, he was hunted through wilderness caves. Before Christ began his ministry, temptation met him in the desert. The pattern is ancient and deliberate. Hell recognizes destiny long before most humans do. The enemy studies potential. He watches for spiritual awakening. He understands that one surrendered soul can influence generations, destroy cycles, and expose lies that kept others imprisoned for years. This is with some attacks feel strangely targeted. You may notice that just as you begin praying more deeply, distractions suddenly multiply. The moment you decide to change your life, old temptations return with greater force. When you attempt to separate from toxic habits, emotional exhaustion suddenly appears. It is not because you are weak, it is because spiritual resistance intensifies whenever movement toward purpose begins. The enemy fears momentum. He fears discipline. He fears obedience. Most of all, he fears a chosen person who finally realizes their identity in God. C.S. Lewis understood that evil rarely announces itself openly. It works subtly, patiently, and intelligently. In many ways, the greatest attacks are not dramatic tragedies but quiet compromises. A little discouragement here, a little distraction there. A slow erosion of conviction until the soul forgets what it once heard clearly from heaven. The enemy understands that if he cannot completely destroy a chosen person, he can still attempt to delay them. Delay becomes one of darkness's favorite weapons because postponed obedience slowly weakens spiritual confidence. A person begins doubting their calling simply because the journey became difficult. But difficulty has never been proof that God abandoned someone. Often it is confirmation that the path matters. Nobody attacks an empty vault. Nobody wages war over something worthless. The intensity of the battle around your life may actually reveal the value of what you carry within you. There are gifts inside you that threaten chains placed upon entire bloodlines. There is wisdom inside you that could awaken others. There is healing inside your testimony that could rescue people from despair. And because of this, the enemy attempts to exhaust you before you fully step into assignment. This exhaustion is not always physical. Sometimes it arrives emotionally, sometimes mentally, sometimes spiritually. You may feel periods where confusion clouds your thoughts and motivation disappears without explanation. You may feel isolated even while surrounded by people. The chosen often experience loneliness because awakening creates separation between those pursuing truth and those content with illusion. Few people understand the burden of carrying unseen purpose. Others may only see your struggle while heaven sees your preparation. One of the enemy's greatest Saint strategies is convincing the chosen that the attack itself means they should quit. But what if the pressure is happening precisely because the breakthrough is near? What if the chaos surrounding you is not evidence of defeat but proof that the enemy senses movement in the spirit before you do? Many people turn back moments before transformation because they interpret warfare as failure instead of recognizing it as resistance against destiny. Fear also becomes stronger when purpose approaches. The closer you move toward calling, the louder insecurity often becomes. Suddenly your mind replays old mistakes, past shame, and every reason you feel unqualified. The enemy desperately wants the chosen to focus on their weakness rather than God's power. Moses doubted his speech. Gideon doubted his strength. Jeremiah doubted his age. Yet God has always specialized in using imperfect vessels because the glory belongs to him, not human ability. You must also understand that some battles are allowed because they build spiritual endurance. A sword is not formed without fire. Faith is not strengthened without testing. God permits certain struggles because shallow belief cannot sustain deep because The chosen are often trained through pressure so they can carry authority without collapsing beneath it later. What feels unbearable now may actually be preparing your spirit for responsibilities your current version could not yet survive. And somewhere in the middle of this warfare, a dangerous temptation appears, the temptation to return to comfort, to stop praying, to stop believing, to stop pursuing what God placed inside you. The enemy whispers that surrendering your calling would finally bring peace, but the peace offered by compromise is temporary and hollow. Deep within, the chosen know they were created for more than survival, more than routine, more than existing without purpose or eternal meaning. And yet, despite all the resistance, the deepest struggle often does not come from the outside world. It comes from within. The spirit hears what heaven is saying long before the mind is willing to accept it. This is why so many chosen ones live in quiet conflict. Deep inside, they sense God calling them toward change, toward surrender, toward separation from certain habits and environments. But the mind keeps searching for excuses to delay obedience. The spirit recognizes this truth immediately, while the human mind fears the cost attached to it. There have been moments when you felt something heavy pressing against your heart in complete silence. No voice spoke audibly, yet you knew within yourself that God was trying to get your attention. Perhaps it happened late at night when distractions faded and your thoughts became impossible to escape. Perhaps it came through a sudden conviction during prayer, a strange uneasiness around certain people, or an overwhelming awareness that your current path could not continue forever. The spirit has been hearing what the mind keeps trying to silence. C.S. Lewis often wrote about the tension between eternity and earthly distraction. Human beings possess an eternal longing buried beneath temporary desires, yet many spend their lives trying to drown that longing with noise. The modern world has perfected distraction. Endless entertainment, endless opinions, endless scrolling, all designed to keep people occupied enough to avoid confronting the deeper condition of their souls. But no amount of distraction can permanently silence the voice of God once He begins awakening a chosen person. The Spirit continues here, in truth, even while the mind resists it. This resistance usually comes from fear. The mind immediately calculates what obedience might require. What will need to change? Who might walk away? What comforts will disappear? What risks will have to be taken? The flesh craves certainty, but God often calls people forward before every detail is revealed. This is why spiritual awakening feels uncomfortable. The spirit recognizes that transformation is necessary, while the mind desperately tries to preserve the old life. A person can remain trapped between conviction and hesitation for years, hearing the truth repeatedly, while never fully surrendering to it. You may have already experienced this battle. There are certain things you can no longer pretend not to know. God has exposed patterns, attitudes, compromises, and relationships that once seemed acceptable, but now disturb your peace. What used to feel normal now creates inner conflict because your spirit has matured beyond it. Yet the mind keeps attempting negotiations with God. Maybe later. Maybe after one more season. Maybe after things become easier. But delayed obedience slowly hardens the heart. The longer truth is ignored, the heavier the soul becomes. The frightening reality is that many people spend their entire lives hearing God while never responding fully. They collect inspiration without transformation. They listen to sermons, read verses, speak about faith, yet continue resisting the very changes heaven is calling them toward. Knowledge alone does not change a life. Even demons recognize truth intellectually. What separates the chosen is the willingness to obey what the spirit already knows. There is also a loneliness attached to spiritual hearing. Often the people around you cannot sense what you sense. They may think you are overreacting or becoming too serious. Some may even mock the convictions growing inside you because your awakening forces them to confront their own sleeping condition. The chosen frequently feel misunderstood because they are responding to spiritual realities invisible to others. Noah looked foolish building an ark before rain existed. Abraham looked foolish leaving everything familiar without seeing the final destination. But faith has never depended upon popular approval. Sometimes the spirit warns through restlessness. You try to enjoy things that once entertained. Yet an emptiness remains afterward. You attempt to return to old patterns, but your peace disappears each time. This is not punishment. It is evidence that God is refusing to let your soul remain comfortable in places you have spiritually outgrown. The chosen lose peace in lower places because heaven is calling them upward. The mind, however, keeps demanding proof. It wants guarantees before surrender. It wants visible outcomes before trusting God completely. Yet some of the greatest miracles in history began with people moving forward despite uncertainty. Faith is not the absence of questions, it is the decision to obey, even while questions still exist. Your spirit already recognizes what your future requires, even if your mind continues trembling at the cost. And perhaps this is why the inner conflict has become stronger lately. God is no longer allowing you to remain divided between two lives. One part of you longs for comfort and familiarity, while another part burns for truth and transformation. The Spirit is pulling you toward eternity, while the flesh clings to temporary security. Eventually a decision must be made, because no soul can live forever standing between conviction and surrender. That decision becomes the dividing line between those who merely admire truth and those who are transformed by it. There comes a moment in every chosen person's life when obedience can no longer wait for complete understanding. The human mind naturally desires explanation before action. It wants God to reveal the entire map before taking the first step. Yet heaven rarely works that way. God often speaks in directions rather than detailed answers, because obedience itself is part of the transformation. If every outcome were visible from the beginning, faith would no longer be necessary. This is where many people remain trapped for years. They keep asking God for more signs while ignoring the instructions already given. They pray for clarity while resisting the truth they already know in their spirit. But revelation increases through obedience, not hesitation. Noah did not fully understand the flood when he first began building the ark. Abraham did not know where he was going when he left his homeland. Peter did not understand how water could hold human weight when Christ told him to step out of the boat. In each case, understanding followed movement. Heaven remains, ponded to action, not comfort. C.S. Lewis once captured the danger of endless hesitation when he described how gradual compromise hardens the soul. A person convinces themselves they are merely waiting for the right time, while slowly becoming spiritually numb. Delay appears harmless in the beginning. Tomorrow feels guaranteed. Another opportunity seems certain. But postponed obedience creates distance between the soul and the voice of God. Conviction grows quieter when repeatedly ignored. The chosen must learn that immediate obedience protects spiritual sensitivity. You already know there are areas of your life where God has been asking for surrender. Perhaps it is a habit you continue defending even though your spirit feels convicted every time you return to it. Perhaps it is a relationship draining your peace while you keep praying for signs you have already received. Perhaps it is a calling you keep avoiding because fear whispers that you are unqualified. The mind searches endlessly for reassurance because obedience threatens comfort. Yet growth has never been born from comfort zones. Destiny waits beyond the border of familiarity. The terrifying thing about obedience is it often requires movement before emotions agree. Many people believe they must first feel ready before responding to God, but readiness is often created through the act of obedience itself. Courage does not appear before the step, it appears during the step. Faith matures while moving, not while remaining still. The Israelites did not see the waters separate until they approached the edge. The priests carrying the ark had to place their feet into the river before the miracle opened before them. God repeatedly asks people to trust Him in darkness before revealing what waits on the other side. This is why the chosen experience such deep inner warfare before major breakthroughs. The flesh fears surrender because surrender destroys the illusion of control. Human beings desperately want guarantees about the future. They want certainty about relationships, finances, success, and outcomes. But God is less interested in making people comfortable than He is in teaching them dependence upon Him. Obedience shifts trust away from human understanding and places it into divine authority. There are also moments when obedience appears unreasonable to everyone around you. Others may question on your decisions because they cannot hear what heaven spoke privately to your spirit. Noah looked foolish building an ark under clear skies. Abraham looked reckless leaving security behind. Moses looked unqualified confronting Pharaoh. Yet God has always chosen paths that require faith because faith reveals whether a person trusts His voice above public opinion. One of the enemy's greatest strategies is persuading the chosen to wait until fear disappears. But fear often remains present even while destiny is unfolding. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is obedience despite fear. The enemy understands that if he can keep someone overthinking long enough, they may never step into the assignment prepared for them. Endless analysis becomes spiritual paralysis. The soul remains stuck between conviction and action while years quietly disappear. And still, God continues calling. Patiently, repeatedly, mercifully. Not because He needs your obedience for His sake, but because your future depends upon it. There are blessings connected to surrender that cannot be reached through disobedience. There are doors waiting on the other side of trust. There are dimensions of peace, wisdom, and authority that only become visible after the chosen decide to move without having every answer in their hands. The hardest truth for many people to accept is that understanding is often a reward for obedience rather than a prerequisite for it. God does not always explain himself immediately because explanation can create dependence upon logic instead of dependence upon him. The chosen are not called to walk by sight alone. They are called to trust the voice of heaven even when the road ahead disappears into uncertainty, even when others doubt them, even when their own mind trembles beneath the weight of surrender, and it is often during that trembling surrender that separation begins. One of the most painful realities the chosen must face is that not everything in their current life can follow them into the next season God has prepared. Many people speak about elevation, purpose, and destiny, but few speak honestly about the loneliness attached to spiritual growth. God is not only calling you towards something, he is also pulling you away from things that can no longer remain attached to your soul. Separation is rarely comfortable, yet it is one of heaven's most necessary acts of mercy. God is separating you from what cannot enter your next season because carrying certain weights any further would destroy the future waiting ahead of you. Human beings naturally become attached to familiarity. Even unhealthy environments can feel safe simply because they are known. People remain inside toxic cycles because the fear of change appears greater than the pain of staying the same. But the chosen eventually discover that destiny demands pruning. A tree cannot grow stronger while dead branches continue draining life from it. This separation often begins subtly. Conversations that once felt enjoyable suddenly leave your spirit exhausted. Places you once loved begin feeling empty. Certain relationships become heavier instead of life-giving. At first, the mind tries to resist these changes. You attempt to hold on to old connections because of memories, loyalty, or fear of loneliness. But deep inside, the spirit recognizes that something has shifted permanently. God has started exposing what no longer belongs in your future. C.S. Lewis understood that attachment to temporary things can quietly weaken the soul. People often cling to what feels comfortable even when comfort, RT, becomes a prison. They fear losing people, habits, or identities that were never meant to last forever. Yet God loves the chosen too deeply to allow them to remain chained to environments that slowly suffocate purpose. Sometimes the greatest act of divine love is removal. Not every closed door is punishment. Not every ending is destruction. Some endings are rescue operations designed by heaven itself. The painful truth is that not everyone celebrating you today is assigned to walk beside you tomorrow. Some people were only meant for a particular chapter of your journey. Their role was temporary, even if your emotions wanted permanence. The chosen often struggle with this because their hearts are loyal. They continue trying to save relationships long after God has withdrawn peace from them. They keep reopening doors heaven already closed because loneliness feels frightening. But delayed separation creates prolonged suffering. There are people who only understand the old version of you. They were comfortable with you while you remained smaller, quieter, distracted, or spiritually asleep. But the moment God begins transforming you, tension appears. Some will mock your growth. Othello will resent your boundaries. Some may even accuse you of changing, not realizing that transformation is exactly what heaven required. The chosen frequently lose relationships not because they became arrogant, but because their spirit could no longer survive in places built upon compromise. God also separates the chosen from destructive habits and false identities. There are patterns you once used to cope with pain that cannot survive where God is taking you. Some people hide inside addiction, validation, endless entertainment, lust, bitterness, or constant distraction because they fear facing the deeper condition of their soul. But eventually God begins confronting these hiding places, not to shame you, but to free you. Deliverance often feels painful because the flesh mourns what the spirit is trying to escape. One of the hardest parts of separation is silence. There are seasons where God removes familiar support systems so the chosen learn dependence upon him alone. This can feel terrifying because humans naturally seek reassurance from visible things. Yet isolation often becomes sacred preparation. Moses spent years hidden in the wilderness before leading a nation. David as isolated in caves before becoming king. Even Christ withdrew into lonely places repeatedly before fulfilling divine assignment. Heaven frequently separates before it elevates. And during this process, confusion can become overwhelming. You may question why certain friendships suddenly collapsed, why opportunities disappeared, or why your heart no longer feels connected to environments you once loved. But God sees what you cannot yet see. He understands which connections would sabotage your future. He knows which environments would eventually poison your peace. The chosen are often protected through separation long before they fully understand what they were being protected from. There is also grief attached to growth. People rarely discuss this honestly. Even necessary endings can hurt deeply because the heart remembers what once felt meaningful. You may miss people who are no longer healthy for your spirit. You may mourn versions of yourself that God is asking you to leave behind. Transformation requires death before resurrection. Something old must end for something greater to emerge. Yet many chosen ones make the mistake of returning to what God already removed them from. They revisit old habits, old mindsets, old relationships, hoping things will somehow feel different. But once heaven awakens a soul, lower places begin feeling unbearable. The peace you once had there disappears because God refuses to let you remain comfortable beneath your calling. The separation feels severe precisely because your destiny is valuable. And perhaps this is the season you are standing in now, the painful space between what is ending and what has not yet fully arrived. The old life no longer fits, but the new season has not completely unfolded. This middle place can feel lonely, uncertain, and deeply uncomfortable. Yet it is often here, in the silence of separation, that God reshapes the chosen into someone capable of carrying the weight of the future waiting ahead.